In the 9th century, the Vikings were the stuff of nightmares. They were the kind of warriors who could show up at your door uninvited, crash your feast, and take off with your treasure, your livestock, and maybe even your family. Because why not? Kings quaked at the mere mention of them. Monks huddled together in prayer, and villagers buried their valuables, and sometimes themselves, in the hope of surviving the next raid. The Vikings didn't just raid. They redefined the art of pillaging. But beneath the savage raids and the aura of invincibility was a weakness they never saw coming. It wasn't a rival army or an epic storm that brought them down. Nope, it was their own hearts, their thirst for forbidden love, and, let's face it, a little too much enthusiasm for, extracurricular activities. While Viking raids raged abroad, King Sigurd of Sweden gave birth to a boy, and he named him Ragnar. This bouncing baby boy grew up strong and fair, with a kingly aura that screamed, "Future badass incoming." By the time he was grown, Ragnar wasn't interested in playing king on his cozy Scandinavian throne. No, this guy wanted action. He wanted glory. Luckily, just across the sea lay the perfect target, Francia, land of wealth, power, and an army Ragnar was itching to humiliate. The year is 845. A chill morning mist rolls over the River Seine in France, and on the horizon, dozens of Viking longships cut through the water, their dragon-headed prows glinting in the pale light. Standing tall on the lead ship is Ragnar Lodbrok. Yes, that Ragnar, clad in fur and leather and don't mess with me vibes. His axe glints like frost in the pale light. Honestly, if this were an action movie, this would be the trailer. As Ragnar's fleet reached the city's outskirts, church bells began to ring. Desperate cries for salvation. Monks scrambled to hide their relics, peasants bolted their doors with trembling hands, and the Frankish King Charles the Bald assembled an army to defend his capital. But let's be real, no army could match the storm that was a Viking raid. Ragnar's warriors leaped from their ships, axes and shields in hand, cutting down anything that moved. The Seine ran red that day. Paris was left weeping and wondering what just happened. King Charles, realizing his army wasn't up to the task, tried Plan B, bribed the Vikings to leave. Ragnar walked away with 7,000 livres of gold and silver. Basically the medieval equivalent of take my wallet and go. For the Vikings, it was just another day at work. For years, this was the Viking peak. Brutal raids, unstoppable warriors, and leaders like Ragnar who made the world tremble. They weren't just fighters, they were survivors, seizing what they needed to thrive in the harsh, unforgiving lands of Scandinavia. But here's the thing about peaks, they don't last forever. Behind the bloodshed and plunder, cracks were already forming. You see, Ragnar wasn't just raiding for gold, he was thinking ahead. Back home, his sons were growing up, and he wanted to give them a legacy. And this is where things start to change. By the early 10th century, the Viking age of endless raiding was starting to slow down. Ragnar's legacy of fierce conquest had inspired generations of warriors, but the lands they raided were changing. Coastal defenses were stronger, kingdoms were uniting, and the treasure hoards they plundered were beginning to dwindle. And then came the moment no Viking had prepared for, the realization that they couldn't fight forever. Some leaders saw an opportunity, not in conquest, but in settlement. And that brings us to one of the most pivotal figures in Viking history, a man named Rollo. Rollo wasn't your average Viking, standing over 6 feet tall with a voice that boomed louder than the North Sea. He was a legend on the battlefield. But even Rollo, after years of pillaging France, began to see the writing on the wall. He realized that if the Vikings wanted to thrive, they needed more than swords. They needed land, alliances, and yes, marriages. One fateful day in 911, Rollo stood before Charles the Simple, the king of West Francia. Charles offered him a deal. "No more raids," the king said, "and I'll give you land." Rollo stroked his beard, his warriors shifting uneasily behind him. They didn't come here to bargain, they came to plunder. But Rollo saw something his men didn't: the future. He agreed to the deal. In exchange for the fertile lands of Normandy, Rollo swore loyalty to Charles. He even agreed to marry into French nobility, taking the king's daughter as his bride. This was the turning point. Rollo's men watched in silence as he knelt before a Frankish priest, letting the icy water of baptism wash over him. He had traded his gods, his freedom, and a piece of his Viking soul for a chance at survival. Rollo's choice wasn't unique. It was the start of a trend. Across Europe, Vikings were doing the unthinkable, marrying local women, settling in foreign lands, and adopting new ways of life. They still carried the blood of raiders, but they were becoming something different. Rollo's deal with King Charles wasn't just a political arrangement. It was a ripple in the Viking world that would grow into a tidal wave. As Vikings spread across Europe, from the British Isles to France, and even as far as Russia, they didn't just raid, they settled. And with settlement came relationships. Marriages, affairs, and alliances that blurred the lines between Viking and local cultures. Picture this: a Viking chieftain named Eric strides into a bustling English village. The locals fall silent as his opposing frame looms over the market square. But instead of terrorizing the market, Eric pauses at a stall selling woven cloth. Behind the counter is a Saxon woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. Her name is Ethelwyn, and she doesn't flinch as the warrior stares her down. Over the next few weeks, Eric finds reason to return. Their banter turns to affection, and before long, Eric isn't just visiting the market. He's sharing Ethelwyn's bed. But this blending of cultures came at a cost. The fierce independence and warrior ethos of the Vikings began to soften. Eric, once a raider feared across the North Sea, now found himself tending to sheep and worrying about the next harvest. Ethelwyn, for her part, taught him to pray to the Christian God, a practice that, at first, felt like betrayal, but soon became routine. This was what happened in all Viking settlements. They were marrying beautiful local women. Not all of these marriages were due to love. Most of the Viking leaders married for political alignments that were necessary for survival. But these intermarriages came at a cost. The fierce and independent warrior vibe of Vikings was softening. They weren't worried about gold or adventure anymore. A fertile farm year and a beautiful foreign woman was enough. The results of these intermarriages were children with a mix of father's wilderness and mother's softness in Christianity. Sons weren't bloodthirsty Vikings, and they weren't Saxon Christians either. This erosion of identity was the beginning of the end of Vikings and what they used to be. By the 11th century, the Vikings were no longer the terror of Europe. They were its neighbors, its rulers, even its kings. The once proud raiders who struck fear into the hearts of monks and peasants alike were now blending seamlessly into the very cultures they had once terrorized. Take Canute the Great, for example. Canute was the son of a Viking king, Sven Forkbeard, and he inherited all the ferocity of his ancestors. But unlike his ancestors, he didn't plunder England, he ruled it. Imagine him, seated on a gilded throne in Winchester, wearing a crown that would have seemed ridiculous to his great-grandfather. At his side was Queen Emma of Normandy, a cultured Christian woman whose influence transformed the way Canute governed. Canute was a warrior at heart, but as king, he embraced diplomacy, lawmaking, and even Christianity. He built churches, passed fair laws, and worked to unite his subjects. To his Viking kin, he might have seemed soft, but to the English, he was a just and powerful king. Canute's reign was a perfect symbol of how the Viking identity had shifted, from raiders to rulers, from pagan warriors to Christian kings. This wasn't just happening in England. Across Europe, Vikings were adopting the customs, languages, and religions of the lands they settled in. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo became French-speaking nobles. In Russia, the Varangians, the Eastern Vikings, helped establish the Kievan Rus, blending Norse and Slavic traditions. But here's where it gets interesting. As these Vikings assimilated, their once fearsome culture began to vanish. Their traditions, their gods, even their language faded into history, leaving behind only echoes. One pivotal moment that marked this decline was the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. On one side stood King Harold Godwinson of England, defending his kingdom. On the other, Harald Hardrada, a Viking king hailed as the last great Norse warrior. Harold had come to England with dreams of conquest, leading an army of hardened warriors who still carried the fire of their ancestors. But the days of unstoppable raids and easy victories were gone. Harold Godwinson's army was prepared, and the English king's forces caught the Vikings off guard. At Stamford Bridge, Harold fought valiantly, his axe carving through enemy lines. Yet for all his strength, it wasn't enough. Harold fell in battle, and with him died the last flicker of the Viking warrior spirit. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge was a sobering moment. The Vikings, once Europe's nightmare, had been beaten at their own game. And while small raids continued for a time, the Viking Age as the world knew it was over. But here's the thing, it wasn't swords or shields that truly defeated the Vikings. It was something much slower, much quieter. The very traits that made them so successful, adaptability, ambition, and an eye for opportunity, also sealed their fate. Every time a Viking warlord married a local noblewoman, every time a chieftain converted to Christianity, every time a Norse child learned a foreign tongue, the Viking identity faded just a little more. This was how the Viking Age truly ended, not with swords or shields, but with love, ambition, and the quiet erosion of time.